Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 23rd of October 2023. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, and this week we're able to proceed with the conversation that we wanted to have last week regarding the Memorandum of Understanding between CIfA and FAME, as last week we were waiting on some answers to questions from those organisations and also members of FAME. And this week we are proceeding. You'll see what shape that takes in the second half of this week's show, methinks. However, before then, we're going to dive in with a couple of news lines to keep an eye on, or ongoing developments, and then we're going to talk about the British Museum. First and foremost, I guess, in this little selection is the Dambusters officers' mess has been granted listed status to safeguard its heritage. Now, this is historic England stepping in and listing a site, well, a building in a site that people who've been watching us in recent weeks will know has been the focus of a lot of back and forth between the local council, national government, heritage concerns, and questions over the housing of people seeking asylum in this country. Why have they done this now? This feels as though, aren't they wading into a minefield? It just,
Right. But you're right in that the timing of this
skipping
is really
into a minefield. Yeah.
I'm bouncing into a minefield.
Yeah. Oh, way.
And in fact, although it's the famous, obviously, Scampton is connected with 617 Squadron, the Dambusters, and the famous Barnes-Wallis bouncing bomb, except the RAF's term for the Barnes-Wallis bouncing bomb used during Operation Chastise was in fact a mine. So you're not that far away when you talk about stepping into a minefield.
Well, obviously it was on purpose.
Of course it was.
Yes, of course it was.
Yes, because you're just as much as a World War II conflict archaeology nerd as I am.
Oh, yes, I love World War II. Go on.
No. The timing of this is really interesting.
Yeah.
The RAF, there were already listed buildings at Scampton, and you might remember, our viewer might remember that the proposal to remove the memorial to Wing Commander Guy Gibson's dog, which is outside one of the listed buildings at Scampton already. This is a new listing. It's another building that's associated with 617 Squadron, with the Dambusters raid. It's and that gives it its historic interest. It's otherwise a fairly standard officers' mess for a bomber command station, but it has particular historical importance. Now, the listing here was actually requested by West Lindsey Council. West Lindsey District Council, who have jurisdiction over the area for planning purposes, and they applied to Historic England for the building to be considered for listing because they wanted to safeguard its historical importance. Now, this would have been as part of the plans to develop the site as a tech hub and industrial hub after the RAF withdrew.
Yeah.
People might remember we talked about the £300 million plan that West Lindsey says is in place to bring the site back into use after now that the RAF have left, and that includes its use as also a heritage hub, an aviation heritage hub, with the listed buildings being at the centre of it. And one of the bigger missions in terms of the listed buildings, there are hangars already and other buildings, but not the officers' mess, and that's obviously most directly associated with the operation of the base and particularly the air crew, most of whom would have been officers. So that there's a strong heritage justification for doing it. It just so happens that the announcement coming now, just a few weeks before West Lindsey takes the Home Office to court for a judicial review for the Home Office's plan to turn the site not into an a new tech industry and heritage hub, but an accommodation centre for asylum seekers. Put it this way, it just draws further attention to the question of why the heck the Home Office have chosen this site in the first place. given the sensitivity of its historical associations.
Yeah, yeah, and presumably they would have been able to get word on the fact that another listing aspect was in the works on the site, and in that sense, I guess a minefield, a minefield. Do I keep on saying minefield? I don't know. A minefield has grown up around historic England in this context. It's not that they've come charging in after the fact. Yeah, but again, yeah, developments continue on the site, I suppose. Do you have any sense of whether this will help West Lindsey Council, or whether this is going to continue to be ignored by it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Councillor Trevor Young, who's the leader of West Lindsey District Council, said that the listing was a positive for the site, and in a press release issued by the council, which we'll link to, he said, this recognition of the high degree of special interest, specifically at the base's role in some of the most famous actions of World War II, is a really positive outcome for the site, particularly as there remains an element of uncertainty around its short-term future. That is understating it somewhat, but being very diplomatic. But he's much more direct. In a further quote, Councillor Young adds, custodians of listed buildings hold a privileged position, having an important role to play in protecting the nation's heritage for future generations. And with that privilege comes a great responsibility to not only protect that asset, but also ensure it has a sustainable future. And then he addresses the Home Office directly. It is hoped the Home Office will take these responsibilities seriously and afford the newly listed officers' mess and the existing C-type hangars the protection they deserve. Now, that comes against the background, as our regular viewers will know, of an accusation that the Home Office has acted illegally in undertaking invasive works contrary to the planning legislation, including regarding historic buildings, potentially and certainly archaeology in the ground at Scampton.
Again, this will continue. I daren't guess how it's going to end up, but it's a fascinating little case study that I'm sure when it does end, we'll be able to look back on and see, see it for its full weave of this tapestry as it's unfolding. Next, we have a story in the wake of the British Museum announcing and admitting that it had had 2,000 items allegedly stolen, allegedly sold online, quite possibly allegedly on eBay, allegedly. Museums across the country actually have been taking a look at their own collections and seeing what's going on there. There are a few different links that I can link to below. I'll lift them from the Archaeology Facebook feed when editing this. But the one that we're highlighting now is Glasgow Museum being unable to locate a Rodin sculpture estimated to be worth around £3 million. It's not great. Does this mean? I mean, what does this mean? Like, does this basically just highlight that the British Museum is a normal museum and most museums have things that have gone missing?
I think we're seeing increasingly one of the sort of the dirty secrets of the museum world coming into the open. That museums do lose stuff, and in fact have been losing stuff for years. This refers to you talk about Rodin sculpture. In fact, it's a plaster cast of one of Rodin's most famous works, The Burghers of Calais. There's one version of the Burghers of Calais is actually in the gardens next to the House of Commons, the Houses of Parliament in Westminster, just down the road from me, and I've seen it many times. And Rodin often executed the same work in different materials, and in fact, art historians talk about a hierarchy of Rodin's works. So thinking of one of the most famous works, the Thinker, the marble version of the Thinker, is seen as the sort of the top of the Rodin hierarchy. Working down through are the repeatable artifacts, the bronze castings, where you might have more than one example of the same work. And in fact, there are a number of versions of the Burghers of Calais. And then finally, there are these plaster casts, which are used to create molds, and sometimes they're destroyed, and sometimes, as in this case, they're kept. So they're still an example of the sculptor's work, but they're not as durable as the bronzes or the marble examples. In fact, this particular example was last seen in an outdoor exhibition in Kelvin Grove Park in Glasgow in the autumn of 1949. So we're dealing with something that disappeared over 70 years ago.
Well, that was last seen over
or
the 70
appears
years
to
ago.
have last seen over 70 years ago. Yeah. And it's one of over 1,500 works unaccounted for across museums in Glasgow, apparently, according to a report in the Times.
Yeah. It's interesting that this is happening, and it's a little bit like so many other cultural moments when people start stepping forward, or when something is revealed, other instances start to feel that they can reveal themselves, or a certain amount of cultural currency is given to the conversation surrounding these issues. Obviously, we're about to talk about the British Museum specifically, but in this case, it's interesting how. So this is a quote from Jérôme Leblay. He said, "We lose a bit of humanity when we lose works of art. Museums may have 100,000 items or so occasionally. Things get dropped or get lost in shipping. Art is often destroyed in acts of war. That's life. But when it goes missing as a result of mishandling or mismanagement by people, it is utterly shameful." And I think that's got to be the thread that we hold on to as heritage professionals, is that there is, life happens and things can break, things can go missing through happenstance. But where there is as far as possible, it's your job to try and not to mishandle or mismanage the artifacts in your care, I guess. And that's, I suppose what I'm saying is this isn't a case of, all museums have this problem. It's a case of, well, yeah, they do, but the job of museum management is to minimize this problem as much as possible, and to be on top of it as much as possible. Again, humanly possible, not, it's not a zero-sum game in that sense.
I think there's another aspect to this, though, which I find really interesting, and in particular with the Rodin that's gone missing from Glasgow. It's the insight it gives into how artworks are appreciated even by their owners, and also how one of the world's most famous sculptors, Auguste Rodin, managed his operation as a commercial business, as a business person in Paris 125 years ago. And that is that if you look at the background to this particular plaster cast and the way plaster casts were used, first of all, they were a way for a sculpture studio of turning out works that they could still sell commercially, but were quick and cheap to produce. And that a gallery could buy a plaster of a Rodin. So they could show a Rodin in their gallery, have a Rodin in their collection, without having to go to the expense of buying one of the bronzes or even one of the more expensive and rarer marbles. So that's one part of it. But then also, apparently, there are at least 3 instances before the Rodin Museum in Paris basically claimed the copyright to recreate Rodin's work. But at least 3 museums that had plaster casts destroyed them in using them to make molds to cast their own bronzes. So effectively, they were casting a Rodin at a remove from Rodin's studio.
And
bring it full circle, and maybe why this is so embarrassing now for Glasgow museums. In the 2020s, plaster casts are becoming more generally seen as important art records, artworks in their own right. One of the articles I'm reading here in Archaeology points out that in 2021, the Tate London, which is the more traditional part of the Tate collection, as opposed to the Tate Modern on the South Bank. This is the Tate London, just upstream from the House of Parliament. Actually held an exhibition focused entirely on plaster casts. And in fact, the Victoria and Albert Museum also famously has a gallery of plaster casts, including things like Trajan's Column.
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. Yeah. I think I may have seen pictures of those plaster casts, but yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting case, and as I say, as much as it reveals something of the reality of museums, I think holding each other to account is important. Incidentally, Jérôme is part of the Paris-based Comité Rodin. So he is that the museum, or is that just a group who?
I don't know, but what normally happens is there's I don't know if the same terms used for sculpture, but certainly for visual art, groups of scholars who are specialists in a particular artist's career and so on will be appointed or appoint themselves to produce what's called a catalogue résumé. Basically, every acknowledged work of that particular artist is included in the catalogue résumé, and that's used by the museum industry and also obviously collectors, the dealers and so on, to basically say, is this a genuine work or not?
Yeah. So before we move on to the British Museum, there's one more link that we want to draw your attention to, and that is headlined as you'll see below, "Destruction chased them." That's a quote. "Funeral held for those killed in Gaza church airstrike." This is not to comment on the ongoing conflict or the current iteration of the ongoing conflict, but rather to highlight that the fog of war and checking your sources can sometimes churn out something that that you previously shown to be not true. So you may recall, folks at home, that in our last episode we were talking about how certain bot accounts connected to Russia seemingly were claiming that the site of St. Porphyrius Church had been bombed by the IDF, and at that point it hadn't, and we were highlighting how important it is to be aware of different movers in this information war that's unfolding around this conflict. But now, actually, buildings on the site of the church have been struck by the IDF, it seems. The church itself, as far as we can tell, wasn't struck, but the bombing did result in the deaths of 16 people, seemingly Christians and Muslims who were sheltering from bombing. That's it, really, isn't it? We just wanted to highlight that this can change, and in that sense, the fevered dream of a bot account trying to sort of throw out orthodox rallying calls in terms of getting people angry about a fictional happening, a fictional bombing. It doesn't necessarily mean that bombing won't occur later on, and you need to be aware of is this other news story actually one that's worthwhile acknowledging, i.e. has it been confirmed? In this instance it has. Do you have anything to add to that?
Only that, again, as I said in the previous piece when we talked about the alleged attack on St. Porphyrius Church, which was actually fake news, it is so important to check your sources. It's this is an Orthodox church. It's the oldest in Gaza. It's dedicated to St. Porphyrius, who basically, according to legend, cleared out the pagan temples and founded the Christian church in Gaza. And so it's deeply important, and it's not a mosque, it's not a Muslim site, it's a Christian site. And that was designed, the original fake news was designed to anger Orthodox Christians, and particularly, I suspect, given it was a Putin adjacent account that put the fake news out at the beginning of the conflict in Gaza, the IDF's attacks on Gaza. It was put there to as part of a propaganda effort to destabilize Israel and also countries associated with Israel, like the United States and so on. It was politically inspired fake news. Check your sources, and on this occasion, what had previously been fake news, it's confirmed by the Orthodox Patriarchate in Jerusalem, which effectively is the organizing body for St. Porphyrius in Gaza. And it's also been confirmed, fact-checked by independent journalists in the mainstream media, including The Guardian, which we're quoting. It just goes to prove that, on both sides here, we're dealing with an incredibly emotionally charged, incredibly polarized situation, and two immediate sides, Hamas on the one side and the government of Benjamin Netanyahu on the other, both of whom want to claim the moral high ground, both of whom will be destabilized by and their efforts would be destabilized by any sense that they were committing war crimes. In the one case, using civilians as human shields, and in the other case, having too little care for civilian life, in going about a legitimate act of national self-defense. Everybody, both sides of this, are duty bound, legally bound to obey international law. And so this it is so important that if accusations like this are going to be made, they are properly fact checked, and you don't just read the first account, you don't just believe the first account that you read on X, Twitter, or any other social media. And I think the other thing I would say, just to finish, is that at the time of recording, the IDF have effectively admitted something happened. They say they attacked a building in the immediate vicinity of the church, and that did cause damage, and they're investigating the incident.
Yeah. So now we are going to move on to the British Museum, and Andy loves a good select committee, or loves my select committees, he's always saying to me behind the scenes. And in this instance, this select committee, which is basically a room on the parliamentary estate where someone of note is brought in to answer questions by MPs on a committee, often sat in a horseshoe facing the interviewee, or whoever it is.
You're absolutely right. Actually, I've been writing a sketch for the Pipeline about this to go with this particular watching brief, and I open it up by saying that it looks like George Osborne has been hauled in with his brief, Sir Marc Jones, sitting to his left to face the local CID. It's the old call in the usual suspects. It does look exactly like that.
Yeah, the UK style or Westminster style select committees are often very, very focused on that person, and everyone's sort of almost surrounding them. But anyway, the point is, Osborne was brought in as the chair of trustees of the British Museum, following the alleged theft of 2,000 items from the British Museum, and it looks as though the takeaway is we was robbed, Gav. It was an inside job. It's we were the victim of an inside job, George Osborne says, according to the BBC here. Is that essentially the takeaway? Is that what they have to report so far? Because obviously this is an ongoing. There is an ongoing police investigation, isn't there?
There is an ongoing police investigation. Now, I should probably just explain to our viewer who isn't familiar with what a select committee does. And I do love a select committee. They can be hugely entertaining as well as hugely informative. I need only refer back to the times when Boris Johnson, when he was, seems like a lifetime ago now, but when he was Prime Minister and was hauled in to explain various activities, shall we say. and decisions made by the government. But basically, the select committees are an instrument of the House of Commons and House of Lords, whereby groups of MPs who aren't ministers have particular areas of expertise and scrutiny, and they call in the relevant ministers, but also witnesses from outside. So, and in this case, the hearing is the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, which is a House of Commons committee, and it was to hear oral evidence as per an inquiry. On the 18th of October, on Wednesday, it was the morning before PMQs. They were actually seeing 4 witnesses in 2 groups. The committee first saw Mr. Osborne and Sir Marc Jones, who's the interim director of the British Museum we talked about when we did our deep dive a few weeks ago, who was brought in to effectively steady the ship. After the entire senior leadership team either resigned or was made to, or chose to, as we were told, step back from their normal duties. So basically, they are now the 2 people who are running the British Museum effectively. Osborne heading up the trustees who oversee the operation overall, and Sir Marc Jones as the director overseeing the day-to-day operation. And then the second half of the hearing was Minister of State for Arts and Heritage, Lord Parkinson of Whitley Bay, so a member of the House of Lords, not an MP.
Of Whitley Bay?
Of Whitley Bay, yep.
Whitley Bay? That's just up the road.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful place. I've been there.
Yeah.
So Lord Parkinson speaking for the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which is the department in government to which the British Museum is responsible, and Maria Balshaw, who is herself part of the director of the Tate Museum, in fact, the Tate Galleries, but more particularly in this case, is also currently the chair of the National Museum Directors Council. So the overall body for directors of Britain's museums.
Right, yeah.
So effectively, you've got the immediate issues relating to the British Museum in the first half of the hearing, and then the second half of the hearing, it's the sort of the official response from both government and the national expert body for museum directors. So that's providing the context, if you like.
And in that sense, this is acting as a sort of fact-finding endeavour, isn't it? They're trying to understand what's happened and what's being done about it, that kind of thing. Yeah,
precisely that. And as again, we haven't got time to go into the full 2-hour hearing.
Haven't we? I'm gutted.
I do have a certain amount of. I do have some humanity in my soul. I'm going to spare our viewer that. Look, the transcript is there. More particularly, you can watch it on Parliament TV. It's far more exciting than your average modern, Marvel Universe clone. And you can get your popcorn in, get your tub of popcorn and your Diet Coke, and sit back and kick back and watch George Osborne being accountable in public.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, it's about. It's about being accountable to Parliament, who ultimately hold the purse strings, and who indirectly could be extremely embarrassed if things go badly wrong in this kind of operation, particularly somewhere like the British Museum, where the government has a direct role both in funding but also through the British Museum Act, which controls a lot of what the British Museum can do, and particularly people might remember what they can and can't do in terms of transferring artifacts. And I'll come back to that later, maybe.
And in that sense, effectively, the government also puts, we talked about during the deep dive that people like Osborne are effectively political appointees.
Yeah.
So yeah, if he messes up royally, then the government is sort of on the hook for it. So yeah.
But it's also about being accountable to the public. Remember that these things are televised. You quoted the BBC report. These committee meetings are televised, recorded, clipped for the news bulletins, and and carried in the newspapers. And
So,
if you look,
mhm.
well, can I just say, just to give you people an idea of what goes on? George Osborne is welcomed by the chair of the committee, Caroline Dinenage MP, Dame Caroline Dinenage, and then he immediately goes into a what is clearly a prepared statement. It's a TLDR. For any journalist who isn't going to get any further into this long transcript. He says, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you, and indeed in general for the support that Parliament and government have given us during this difficult period. Then he gets all contrite. I would like to start by apologising again on behalf of the trustees and everyone who works at the British Museum for what has happened. I do not want to minimise the damage that has been done or the shock to the very many members of staff who work at the museum, who've given their lives to the museum and are very upset at what happened. Then he adds a control. There is a police investigation and there is an independent review, as you say, Chair, but essentially we were the victims of an inside job by someone who we believe over a long period of time was stealing from the museum and who the museum had put trust in. So in that first paragraph, he's saying, we're really, really sorry, but as you said at the beginning, we're the victims too. We were let down. We was let down, Gov.
Well, isn't this interesting? Yeah, I see those lines there, and it's probably the most human that we've heard in terms of a response to this from the British Museum or from anyone associated with the British Museum. Obviously, the initial instinct from the previous head of the museum was to obfuscate and deny,
which is why he's now out of a job.
Yeah, Hartwig Fischer, wasn't it? That was yeah.
Then
it was very much a case of we're on it, walls went up. Osborne appeared on national TV that weekend.
With Laura Kunsberg, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, to sort of to just try and steady that ship. But now actually, it seems as though they feel as though they have the breathing space and possibly a slightly necessary, if not genuine, humility to talk about how they have been the victims of theft, and they were in that sense by trusting someone in their staff, they were vulnerable to that theft. It's an interesting one.
It is interesting, and you've got to remember here. And again, if you people who watch, you don't get it from the transcript, but you get it. Well, you get it from a few of the lines in the transcript, maybe, but certainly if you watch the transcript, the body language and so on, whatever you think of him and his politics, Osborne is a pro. He was put up. What clearly happened when everything went south for the BM, when this came out, Osborne, as chair of the trustees, as that political appointment, but with all the political contacts that he's got and all the media contacts that he's got. He immediately, with the BM's comms staff obviously fully on board, set out to reposition the museum, and particularly the museum's trustees and the museum's staff, effectively to say, as you say, we were let down, but now we're on it. And in fact, if you look at the second paragraph in this TLDR first answer, he says, obviously there are a lot of lessons to be learned as a result of that, i.e. what's happened. And then he lists what they've done, what they are doing. He says the member of staff has been dismissed by us. They've been proactive before there's any response from a review, let alone the police.
Yeah.
Then he says the objects have started to be recovered, and I can perhaps say more about that. That's an invitation to the committee to say, oh, right, so you've done really well. You're starting to get the stuff back. How's that happening? How much? Right? And then he says also, we've changed our whistleblowing code, changed our policy on theft, tightened up security around the collection, including in the stores. We have an independent review, which we've commissioned to give us some lessons learned and recommendations by the end of the year. And we're undertaking a big project, which Marc will speak about if you give him the opportunity to digitize the whole collection so that this great national asset is more properly recorded. So there again, he's laying out, yes, we might have had procedural stuff wrong in the past, but in a sense, that's the past now. We're sorting all this stuff out, so you don't really need to go into it in detail, do you? because actually what we want to talk about is the future.
Yeah, well, and that's also been interesting because the reports surrounding this, the digitization, British Museum set to digitize its collection and so on and so forth, is framed here, I believe, by Sir Marc Jones as something that would improve security, but also would quote would mean that quote we are now confident that a theft of this kind can never happen again. It is definitely trying to be a full stop, underline. We from our end we've dealt with this and it's all but done. But actually, if you look a little bit more closely, this is going to be a 5-year project to digitize the BM's collection. And sure, in the meantime, security has been upped, and it's nice to see that they've changed the whistleblowing code. That's nice. That's good to see. Does that imply that potentially people were suggesting that something was happening and that the museum wasn't listening necessarily, or will that come out in the course of whatever comes next in terms of?
Well, there have certainly been allegations that when the alleged thefts were first notified to the museum, I think it was the then deputy director, and ultimately to the then director, Herwig Fischer. The whistleblower was who's actually a Danish collector.
Oh, I see.
Was dismissed. Was fobbed off with everything's fine. We don't think anything's missing.
Right.
And what Osborne and Jones say now is that any allegations of that gravity would immediately be escalated to the trustees.
Okay. Yeah, it needs to be taken seriously. Yeah.
That's right. They will be taken much more seriously.
Okay.
And because basically the system broke down. But it's interesting. I mean, looking at what perhaps if again look at the TLDR, it goes on again into the second question that Osborne answers, because Caroline Dinage asks him whether he was surprised at the way items could go missing. And without anyone spotting it. And then he says, I will ask Marc Jones to say something in a moment. Then, he puffs him up. I'm enormously grateful. Marc came out of retirement to help us in our hour of need when the previous director, and I could almost put this in quote marks, felt he had to resign. I think most people think that Herwig Fischer was quote, resigned by the board.
Yeah.
That's certainly the impression that one.
Is this where the US employment terminology terminated comes in?
Yeah.
He terminated with immediate effect. No.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't. He wasn't seen. There's the famous video of Dominic Cummings leaving Downing Street with his bits in a box. But it wasn't quite that brutal. But I think there's a strong sense that he screwed up the initial handling of this so badly that there was no way he could stay in post.
No.
And if he hadn't chosen to exit, he would have been exited by in no uncertain terms. But anyway, in a sense, that's a sort of side issue. What Osborne goes on to say is Marc has an enormous amount of experience, having run the V&A and the National Museum of Scotland, among other things. And then Osborne, again, being showing a little bit of humility here. I've learned quite a lot from Marc about how museums should think about their collections. Again, I'll come back to that later as well, because Jones made some very interesting comments later on in the hearing. But then the other thing as well is again what Osborne does, and it's all very careful positioning. In terms of okay, you might think it odd that the British Museum doesn't know exactly what it's got, but then he says, I would observe one thing, which is the British Museum has been around for 270 years. It has accumulated millions of objects and still regularly receives bequests. Recording these objects, collecting and the image and identifying where the object came from, its provenance and special properties of that object. It's a complicated task. We do it. On average, around 100,000 objects are recorded each year, and we have over the last couple of decades. So it's a massive task. But you're right to ask us the question. We're certainly asking ourselves questions about what more we can do, and Marc has some specific ideas about that. And the chair says that is a long-winded way of saying whether you were surprised at the way in which items could go missing.
Well, it's interesting as well because they also made clear that that quote, I think this is George Osborne saying that steps had been taken to conceal the thefts, and this involved quote the fact that records. Sorry, this involves the fact that quote records were altered end quote. So it as you say, it's positioning, but it's also it's letting, as you say, this is a fact-finding endeavour. It's letting those MPs and by extension the public know the specific way in which the museum was victimised, I guess you could say, by someone and allegedly, quite possibly, the member of staff who they've dismissed. So it is interesting that out of that they're also turning it into a lesson learning process and a prospect for making the museum better than ever before. I'm just a touch. I'm intrigued by how this digital aspect is being reported. So there's a link here. British Museum to fully digitize its collection after thefts, and I suppose that's the point. Is that this is happening after the thefts. There didn't seem to have been, and I presume they would have said, were it the case, that the museum planned on doing this modernisation prior to these alleged thefts coming to their attention. So it's an interesting, in that sense, it's a masterclass, as you say, in repositioning the museum and its outlook and the culture that they want to encourage within the museum. Yeah. I mean, were there any other interesting bits to come out of?
Well, they confirmed, or Sir Marc Jones confirmed, that approximately 2,000 objects appear to have been stolen, of which 350 are currently, in his words, in the process of being returned.
Right. Okay. But again, specifics there we can't be sure of, can we? Whether it's come from someone's abode or whether it's come from people they've actually been tracking sales and they've been returning items which were sold allegedly.
Yeah. Now the other thing that Jones says, and again, there's a lot of interesting little details in here. If you do want to go through and pick them out, and there's just one other I'll pick out before we talk about the wider context of what was spoken about in the rest of the hearing. But and obviously there's a limit to what they could say, given they're relatively early on in process that they've initiated and that there's a live police investigation. So for example, the individual, while it was alluded to and has been and the person has been named in the press, we're not naming them again, and certainly there have been no charges yet. But one of the things that Jones said, again, which I thought was really interesting and an interesting little detail, he alleges that in the end, the most sustainable and best security for the collections is that they are widely known and widely used. What was wrong here was that these 2,000 objects were really only known to one person, and that person decided to take advantage of that.
Yeah.
So, in other words, this was a museum specialist who had access to a very specialist part of the collection. In fact, it's alleged to be a collection of material that was purchased by the museum in the 18th century. And of classical jewelry and copies of classical jewelry. And that as things stood, one person with that specialist knowledge was able to access valuable material from secure stores on their own. And therein lies the problem. An alleged bad actor with specific knowledge to exploit a particular part of the collection where had it not been for Dr. Gradel, the Danish collector, who recognised the material, that we might never have known what was going on.
No, no.
Because the academic study of that material is so rare.
What of the Parthenon sculptures?
It's a bit of a jump from the part of, but talking about stolen material in the British Museum and then jumping straight to the Parthenon sculptures. I see what you did there. I'll spoiler alert. We're also going to talk about the Benin bronzes. No, look, of course, before this happened, before the alleged theft happened, the two probably most publicly contentious areas of the British Museum's activity were, and again, I'm not playing down the Easter Island statue that has also been requested back, and various other possible. The Egyptians have apparently asked for the Rosetta Stone to be returned. But in terms of public cut through, the Benin bronzes and the Parthenon marbles in particular are the two highest profile controversial parts of the British Museum collection. So obviously they were going to be addressed when the select committee talking about the British Museum it has the chair of governors and the acting director in front of them.
Yeah.
And there were some very interesting conversations around that. Now, again, this is in the context of, and I know it's something you care about very much, quite rightly, about the idea that the British Museum is a London-centric collection. In that it's held, most of the interesting bits are held in London. You have to go to London to see them. Now, what Jones says is we've got quite a strong tradition of working with other museums in the UK. We have 7 full partner museums in Newcastle, Norwich, Truro, Manchester, Carlisle, and Glasgow. And then he says last year we lent to 122 museums in the UK, which is obviously quite a lot. So we're starting by saying, look, we're trying to become more accessible, make the collection more accessible. He doesn't say it in that paragraph, but it's the idea of lending stuff that is of regional interest to museums in the region, so that people in those regions can see their heritage without having to travel to London. And he says that the BM has chosen to go down a partner route rather than having a branch, look, British Museum North or something like that. As the Imperial War Museum has an Imperial War Museum North at Salford Quay, in Manchester, Greater Manchester. But the BM's chosen not to do that. It chooses to partner up with museums instead. And he cites, for example, medieval material going to Norwich. And South Asia galleries being opened at Manchester.
But what of the marbles? Gosh darn it!
Right.
No, sorry. I should say that is genuinely interesting, and it is very welcome. But it's more. I'm sure our international viewer would want to know.
I felt it was important to say that simply because I think I don't recall seeing the BM's policy stated that explicitly before.
No.
In public. It's clear that the museum is being thoughtful, probably because it has to be, about what it holds, where it holds it, and where, more importantly, where it shows it. And then, this obviously has a bearing on the international collection aspects of the collection as well. Now, Osborne, it's again TLDR. He basically goes into a short history of the Elgin marbles or Parthenon marbles, and then he says very critically, it's worth noting they've been controversial ever since they were first allegedly purchased, removed, or removed by Lord Elgin and purchased by Parliament on behalf of the nation. Lord Byron at the time argued strongly to Parliament they should remain in Greece. They've gone through periods when there's been a lot of talk about them and periods when that's not been the case. Of course, there's a lot of interest in them now. So basically he's saying, look at this as a continuum, right? There's nothing new going on here. We've been wrestling with this ever since they were first bought for the nation. Now, first of all, he says that it's important that the museum tells the story not just of ancient Athens and its role in the world, but it sits alongside other great civilizations. The British Museum is one of the few places in the world, there are some others like the Louvre or the Met in New York, where you can come and see all of the great civilizations alongside each other and learn the connections between us, not just our own individual histories. That's the modern version of the Cabinet of Curiosities. The fact that if you look at, take the Rosetta Stone as an example. It was found in Egypt, removed by France, captured by the British, and the languages that are there are, I think if I remember rightly, it's two classical hieroglyphs. I think it's Coptic and Greek.
Yeah.
So you've got three separate cultural traditions just on one object, and noting the Greek, you can then walk from looking at the Rosetta Stone through the galleries where you can see, apart from the marbles, but also all the other Greek material, the pottery, the weapons, and so on and so on and so on. So you can start to look at cultural cross-referencing. Now, then Osborne lays out his stall. He says, all that said, and then he's referring to what should happen to the marbles and where they should be. I think it's worth exploring, and I've been in direct conversations with the Greek government about this, whether there is some kind of arrangement that would allow some of the sculptures to spend some of the time in Greece, and what the partnership would be that was born of that. Obviously, it's not a particularly happy situation where we've had this standoff with Greece for many decades, and the level of scholarship and engagement that we have with many other countries is not one that is replicated with some Greek museums. We want to create a proper partnership. That means objects from Greece coming here and objects that have potentially never left Greece before, and certainly that have never been seen in this country. And that would mean objects from the Parthenon collection potentially traveling to Greece. Now, in context of that, I just point out one of the objects that's been mentioned is one that I was sent a photograph actually of just a couple of hours ago at lunchtime before we started recording by a friend of mine who's currently in Greece and visiting the Museum of Archaeology in Athens, and sent me a photograph of the Mask of Agamemnon that Schliemann found in the 19th century. That's one of the objects that's been talked of as coming to London if an arrangement can be found whereby some of the Parthenon marbles could go back to Greece, to Athens. Now, he admits it's not a difficult problem, and he said it's a problem that British governments of all colours have wrestled with, and the British Museum has wrestled with, and the Greek governments have wrestled with. I'm not saying it's an easy problem to solve, and we may not succeed, but I think it's worth the effort of seeing whether we can find a way through that is to the mutual benefit of Greece, Britain, the British and Greek publics, and indeed the many citizens from many other countries that happen to visit both Athens and London. Now, that I think is really interesting because he's internationalising the problem, and he's also taking it away from the pure remit of politicians and saying we're doing this, we want a solution for the public too, which is not the way that the Parthenon marbles have been talked about very much previously, certainly by people in charge of them.
They've been footballs for national pride, basically, haven't they?
Smart Jones as well makes some very interesting comments along the lines of put it this way, it's a museum professional, a modern museum professional talking about artifacts in a way that, again, I've not often heard in a public forum like this. Because he says what's exciting for people like me is that people care so much about objects and they really matter to them. And he's obviously there talking about both Greek and British people and anybody, and people from Nigeria by extension and so on. These artifacts, these objects can be imbued with a lot of importance by individuals, not just people like you and me, cultural professionals, heritage professionals. He says, although I may be a little over-optimistic, I often feel that these contested objects are also the things that are likeliest to give rise to really exciting and energetic partnerships between the different stakeholders in them. I hope that we can find a way to share other objects that are contested because, quite pragmatically, something can be there on display for 20 years without stopping and nobody ever looks at it. But if occasionally it moves from one place to another, people get very excited about it again and they re-engage with the object. I am quite positive about the idea that objects should be shared. Now, what can he possibly be referencing in a comment like that? Now, he's not just talking about the Parthenon marbles. He's talking about the Benin bronzes, all those other contested objects. He's saying, first of all, that particularly if they're suddenly not there, you might value the heritage even more. But he's also saying that, because if you've got
don't say that. Sorry. But I do know what you mean. Yes, yeah.
He's making a perfect point. People will disagree with it. People will say everything should be sent back now. End of.
No. Sorry.
This is a more sophisticated internationalist, modern look at things, rather than nationalist. These are ours. Internationalist. These belongs to all of us. How can we best share them with the greatest number of people?
I suppose to flip that notion of if something's missing, then you miss it. Again, it's just a touch ironic for the VM. Flip that on its head, and actually another way of saying that is to say what is the good of this material just gathering dust and people slowly but surely essentially forgetting it,
and in fact that point has been made precisely about, for example, the number of Benin bronzes that are in the reserve collection.
Yeah,
and are only there to be seen by scholars who book to see them.
Yeah. No, exactly.
So would it not be better for them to be on display somewhere? And would it not be better for them to be on display in Nigeria where they were first made? It's and is there a way of ways of sharing and borrowing back and into museum loans and so on?
I was particularly impressed with a point in proceedings where, of all things, Oliver Cromwell came up, and an illustrative device that really put some very current issues in UK heritage relations squarely in focus. I think it was a really, really good little moment in proceedings, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, I do. I mean, if we're going to go, there was it's a long hearing. People should look at the transcript, look at the video. But towards the end, there was a passage of questioning about what are crudely called culture war issues. So, for example, Osborne was asked whether the British public should have a say, for example, in the destination of the Parthenon marbles. To which Osborne replied, "I hope you're not suggesting I hold another referendum." He was obviously the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time of the Brexit referendum, and we all know how well that went. And interestingly, in terms of positioning, he said that the British people, polling suggests the British people aren't wedded to the Parthenon sculptures being in Britain for all time and never leaving. Public opinion surveys say that actually a majority of the public would be happy to see some kind of arrangement and agreement and partnership. And he says, if it was easy, it would have been done 200 years ago. It's controversial, but why not try to solve it? And then Jones backed him up by saying, I think there might be reciprocal loans. It's possible we'd see things in London we would never see otherwise. So there could be a real upside to it. So they're positioning themselves as on the side of the public, actually. And then another MP, Jane Stevenson, Conservative MP on the committee, said, on the modern taste for removing statues that are culturally sensitive and considered inappropriate, what role do you think the museum has in educating and leaving things in place to convey the long-term message and history of these objects? What would you be doing that you are not doing yet? Now, that's basically asking them to support, retain and explain.
Yeah.
And we discussed last time that the government has just issued guidance on retain and explain to museums and cultural bodies.
It was a very leading question, wasn't it?
It was an incredibly leading question.
Yeah.
To which Osborne replied, again, very cleverly. Again, whatever you think of him, he's quite smart. And he said, first of all, it's a big subject. In other words, don't oversimplify it, and like you populists oversimplify these things. Then he said, the history of tearing down statues and defacing objects is also the history of humankind. Now there he's referencing things like damnatio memoriae in the Roman period, when the names of a disgraced emperor will be struck from their statues. The iconoclasm in the Byzantine period, the painting over of church murals in the Reformation.
Akhenaten in Egypt.
Akhenaten in Egypt, absolutely. It's not tied just to Judeo-Christian tradition. But then he says the stables in the House of Commons, the chapel in the House of Commons was used as stables by Cromwell's army and desecrated. Now it's been restored. And then I think this is really interesting in terms of the in the context of comments about, for example, we need to retain and explain Colston in the centre of Bristol because he donated to some schools, even though he was responsible for the forcible kidnapping and transfer of tens of thousands of African people to the West Indies and their enslavement. Because what Osborne says is, in the modern context, no one would expect loads of statues of Stalin and Lenin to be dotted around the former Warsaw Pact countries. Things get pulled down. That is part of history. Replace.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, replace Stalin and Lenin with Colston and Sir Thomas Guy.
Well, and also crucially, in some of these former Soviet states, they have parks where Soviet art is displayed. This is it. This is exactly it. This is the point that I think I tend to say a statue that's still standing up has not yet reached the end of its life, archaeologically and historically speaking. And this is another way of saying that. So well done to George Osborne. Never thought I'd ever say that in my life, but well done to George Osborne. Mr. / funding for everything.
Went on to discuss funding, which was quite ironic. Clive Efford, Labour MP, asked, "Are you fixing the roof while the sun is shining?" That was a deliberate reference to a comment that Osborne made about the economy. He said that he was trying to create an economy where we could fix the roof while the sun was shining. We're now seeing, under Sunak, how effective that actually was. They talk about the funding of problems with the projects at the British Museum, the fact that the Great Library reading room is closed currently, but the roof actually of the hall where the Parthenon marbles are kept needs attention because it sometimes leaks.
It's not easy running a British museum.
No, and they talk about have they got enough money, and he talks about the difficulties of fundraising and the fact that what the government gives them isn't enough to do everything, that they have to go to sponsors, that they have to they have a commercial elements like the museum exhibitions, like the exhibitions that go out on loan. I mean, we know one of the curators at the BM whose main job is setting up museums from setting up museum exhibitions from one of the department and flying off. 1 month she's in. She's a specialist in the Pacific cultures, and 1 month she's in Paris with seeing in or out an exhibition. Another month she's in Hawaii seeing in or out an exhibition. And that's all part of the British Museum's operation.
It is interesting, though, having Osborne now managing this museum, which, in his own words, doesn't quite have enough funding from the government. It is interesting. Well, folks, that is that section done and dusted. For now, you can expect a little message from us as to how and why you might support us on Patreon, and we'll see you in just a second. A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. So we move on now from a story where a national institution was brought to a public forum to answer questions of varying difficulty, at times quite uncomfortable questions, and did so with candour, with fairly skillful wit at times, but also as well with a sense of humility as to their role in national life, because it's important that the organisations that claim power in public life and also interact with government are understandable, are fathomable, are contactable, and in this instance, able to explain what they're doing and what they're going to be doing next. So, as I said previously, I'm amazed that I'm impressed with George Osborne in that sense. But we contrast that now with something else, and that is the Memorandum of Understanding between the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists and FAME, the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers. In so much as I hinted at the beginning of this episode, we contacted them last week regarding the MOU, gave a few days to formulate a response, and heard nothing back whatsoever. Not even a whisper. This is a bit of a shame. We contacted the CIfA, FAME, and also some of FAME's members. It's understandable that some of FAME's members wouldn't necessarily want to comment because they're, for the most part, archaeological units and they're not necessarily used to fielding those sorts of queries. But I mean, you for example, suggested that CIfA could have a slot on the show to put forward a spokesperson, didn't you?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Because, and I should explain to our viewer, and particularly if you're not a CIfA member or a member of an FAME organisation, the context for this is that a while back, and you might remember we covered it on the show, FAME, Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers, withdrew from what's called the Industry Working Group, which is a collection, a coming together of archaeological organisations to talk about how archaeology is conducted, who conducts it, terms and conditions, policies towards various issues affecting archaeology and heritage. FAME withdrew from that because the idea that they might be involved in discussions of wages, in particular wages and conditions, they felt would put them in a difficult legal position because it could be seen as that they'd be part of a cartel and that individual employers couldn't negotiate wages for archaeologists within projects. And legal opinion differed on that, I think it's fair to say. So there was a lot of disquiet that albeit the self-appointed organisation for archaeological managers and employers was no longer a part of any kind of wider discussion within the sector, was seen as suboptimal, shall we say. So I think this memorandum of understanding is an attempt to bring FAME back into the sort of constellation of archaeological organisations, but maybe at somewhat arm's length.
Yeah. But again, we don't know that because we haven't had any comment on it in that sense. We can interpret the document in front of us. Interestingly, FAME is now back to calling itself a version of the voice of commercial archaeology, as they used to say on their website, but recently changed. Now it is the distinctive voice in this document of commercial organisations represented by archaeological employers and managers. A voice so distinctive that they don't quite know how to use it. It's a shame. It's a shame that they couldn't comment on this. But at the same time, there's been plenty of comment on this document and what it does and seemingly doesn't necessarily do. Because you say that FAME arguably wanted to be back in the fold of broader archaeological life in the UK, perhaps, and even if at arm's length. But CIfA and FAME don't represent everything that archaeology is and does.
No. It does say things which are relevant to other archaeologists who are outside of those two organisations. And
interestingly, it has a tone that's quite positive and quite collaborative. but its actual effect, I think, as we pointed out in last week's episode, is one of deciding where the boundaries are between these organisations, so they don't step on each other's toes. They say here, for example, CIfA and FAME wish to work collaboratively to maximise the positive influence each organisation has on the archaeological sector. The purpose of this MOU is to set out the understanding between the parties as to their respective roles, interests, responsibilities, and obligations in relation to their respective and joint aims. So it's an odd document, so it's definitely worthwhile going through and seeing where that tension between collaboration and being distinctive lies, I think.
I think there is a tension at the core of this, which personally I think could actually be a break point. Basically, FAME, although in their mission statement, which is quoted in the MOU, talk about collectively to conserve and advance knowledge of the past for the benefit of society, that doesn't appear in the 6 key items which are part of the business plan which the board of FAME governs itself by. So it's there to represent the views of archaeological managers and employers, provide advice, support, and information for members, promote safe, healthy, and environmentally sustainable working practices within the profession, promote best professional practice in business and employment and in technical professional matters, to promote training, development, to build capacity and improve standards within the profession, and to be sustainable, open, transparent, and accountable to our members. Now, CIfA, on the other hand, it talks about technical competence and all the other things that CIfA is involved in, and quite properly and often laudably involved in terms of professional standards. We're going to be talking about soon, for example, their expert groups with regards to human remains. No spoiler alerts here, but there's a key point in CIfA's mission statement, effectively, as quoted in the MOU, which says that CIfA accredited professionals, quote, have duties to society, to those that could benefit from work, to clients and commissioners, colleagues and helpers, to the profession and to themselves. Their fundamental responsibility is to the interests of the public. Now, that is absolutely contrary to what FAME sets out to do. And I think, a lot of this is motherhood and apple pie. Some of it is perfectly sensible, but for example, they talk about we share common interests, and then potential for collaboration and competition. They talk about what they're both invested in. And again, people might see contradictions in some of that. This paragraph, though, I think is critical. It says, where one party considers the other's actions or policies are impeding or may potentially impede their abilities to effectively deliver their own work, they will seek to consult the other to resolve such issues cooperatively. Where practicable, they will add value to the other's work, turning perceived or real competition into synergy. Now, to me, that's most likely one-way traffic. That is FAME seeing, say, for example, CIfA wanting to introduce a, CIfA, make CIfA standard rates more front and center. CIfA may be instituting a policy on sustainable archaeology in the climate emergency, and there's a CIfA workshop coming up on sustainable development. And you can see situations where FAME might say, wait a minute, that could impact on our clients because it might cost them. And that's giving FAME a potential, I'm not saying it would, but a potential break on progressive questions, progressive policies within archaeology.
Well, yeah. I mean, we have seen that having pulled out of the industry working group that they got anxious about conversations about pay and conditions
Yes.
unfolding.
Yes.
And that by its nature has to be a progressive conversation. We're not going to talk about paying people less, are we? I mean, like progress must be made in that conversation. So if that conversation unfolds, so yeah, I can see why you're bringing that up. It's interesting as well that there is this notion of moving towards essentially a federated and or chartered, depending on who's taking the lead in this document, notion of what archaeologists are, the discipline. So terminology here, point 7, page 4. The discipline means all archaeologists. The industry means all paid archaeologists and their employers in capital letters there, or sorry, bold letters there, and their employers. The profession, those archaeologists who have just demonstrated relevant competencies, that's you and me, I guess, committed to maintaining and improving those competencies through CPD. Yes, I guess ongoing research, but they're talking about something which can be documented in that sense.
I'm not sure that does include you and me, you see, because I'm not, cards on the table. I'm not a member of CIfA.
No,
I did consider at one stage, but my work doesn't take me to primarily developer funded work, and I'm not in I don't have an academic tenure to doing archaeological research. Although I've got a master's degree in archaeology, which I think qualifies me at a certain level.
Yeah, but also frankly, the cost as well.
Well, I'm parking that actually. I think. Look, I think the other thing I think, and the reason I think we wanted to discuss this was the way this appeared to come out of left field for even members of CIfA.
Well, and just let me just finish this point here. Then, in that sense, companies through CPD, okay, fair enough. That doesn't apply to us, and not and who practice and are accountable to an ethical standard of working in the public interest. That is us, but the middle clause there, arguably, is a way of isolating. So. This is one of the reasons why in the last episode we invited people to consider how the extent to which this document actually talks about them, and also as well the extent to which they're actually helping archaeology and archaeologists, and that seemingly was one of the weaknesses that some people identified in conversations around this.
Yeah, when the MOU was first published, it was published on the CIfA Facebook group, amongst other places, and was mirrored, was published on the CIfA website. It wasn't published on the FAME website for some weeks, and it was only in the last week or so. It's appeared on the FAME website, but I don't know how often they maintain. That website's maintained. It's not. It doesn't do hot news.
No.
By and large, I think it's fair to say. Was immediately met with some hostility, and again, these are self-selecting samples, so you can't draw too much from them, but there are some points that I think need to be made from them. It was met with some hostility on both the CIfA Facebook page and also Badger, the British Archaeological Jobs Resource community pages, where archaeologists, CIfA members, employees of FAME organisations were saying, this is the first we've heard of it. Why? To the extent that CIfA responded on their Facebook page, which is an open page, anybody can go and visit it.
Linked below.
It says, in line with it explained the background, which it didn't do in the original post. It said, these MOUs are operational documents designed to aid working relationships with other organisations. It in no way attempts to replace the industry working group. Now, it might not intend to replace the industry working group, but it has the effect of covering some of the territory of the industry working group. And as I said, in the constellation of archaeological bodies, I think that maybe lies behind some of this. But anyway, that's me talking. Returning to what CIfA say. The MOU aims to begin the process of building a better and more productive relationship between archaeology's professional institutes and trade association to enable collaborative working to address concerns that affect all parts of the industry. Now that's that's an implicit criticism of FAME, of FAME walking from the industry working group. They're going out, they're extending a hand to FAME and saying, come back with us, at least as far as you can. And then they said, we can only do this by cooperating and communicating. The MOU formalises the basis for collaboration between CIfA and FAME, complementing our long-standing positive working relationship with the Prospect Trade Union. Now, they're the people who are absent from this, who are increasingly important in archaeology, particularly commercial archaeology, because a lot of archaeologists who may also be members of CIfA doesn't operate as a trades union. It's not like the British Medical Association.
No.
But Prospect is a trade union for professional white-collar workers, and an increasingly effective one. A lot of civil servants are also members of Prospect, and it has an archaeological branch, and they've been becoming increasingly important over the last few years, and including in part of in talking about pay and conditions in the working group. Now, okay, but that didn't altogether convince some of the critics. And there's a key point. Again, I'm not going to name this person because it was a comment made on social media. But a CIfA member said, "How will the Professional Institute, CIfA, ensure their standards are followed by members of the trade body, that is FAME, who are very clear on their own website they don't have set rules of behaviour or conduct? This is setting the two organisations in direct opposition, not collaboration."
Yeah.
And then this person added, CIfA look naive here, in my opinion.
Well, and this is my point about the difference between the Chartered Institute and the Federation for Archaeological Managers and Employers. Is this going to be? Are they aiming for archaeology to be federated or to be chartered?
Yes.
Are they aiming for archaeologists to be identifiable by a particular card? What will be on that card? This idea of moving towards a chartered profession by 2027. Well, what does FAME have to say about that? Seemingly not much.
Absolutely. And there's another point I'll make about this as well. A lot of critics, again, on both forums, said, why is this the first we've heard of it? Why weren't we consulted on this? Why have we not been allowed to vote on it?
Why was it published on a Thursday afternoon?
Why was it published? Yeah, why was it published on a Thursday afternoon after CIfA's AGM, where it wasn't mentioned?
And seemingly, as you pointed out, a month after the document was signed, to the day.
It would appear so.
So on the 12th of October, people learned about it. On the 12th of September, it was signed by Tim Malim and Stephen Carter,
who were the chairs of the respective organisations. Tim Malim being of FAME and otherwise of CIfA. I mean, look. Somebody said any decisions to formally define, quote, divvy up areas of interest should be ratified by the Advisory Council of CIfA, at least, ideally by the membership. Otherwise, it smacks of top-down, opaque, anti-democratic imposition. I think that suggests that, to that person at least, the people at CIfA board level who signed off on this badly misjudged their membership. And somebody else went even further and said, I'm afraid what I personally perceive from your explanation, CIfA's explanation, is a doubling down by some executive at executive authority level, rather than an acknowledgement of your lack of transparency has cemented an increased distrust at a delicate time. It makes it difficult for anyone to promote positive aspects of CIfA when stunts, their word, not mine, like this are pulled. I feel sorely disappointed for those CIfA staff whose good work in the past few years has been trampled by this oversight by the board.
On a similar note, there's a comment here, again on social media. For what it's worth, I suspect that this will do nothing for either organisation's reputations amongst the vast majority of professional archaeologists, and will only further illustrate the belief that both are a, quote, again, it's all a quote, but I just want to emphasise this is a quote, cabal of self-interested senior managers only concerned with their own self-advancement. This is incredibly unfortunate for both, as it will only hasten the suspicion that those working for, involved with, or supporting the aims of either organisation do not have the interests the best interests of the profession at heart. Transparency, accountability, and discussion should have preceded this process. None did, by all accounts, and it will taint both organisations. And then they end by saying, I ask, where was the membership's voice in this process?
Now,
Very similar.
I'd like to finish by making two points, or asking two questions, really. One is precisely that one. Where is the voice of the membership? Where is the accountability of those organisations to their members in something which could have quite far-reaching ramifications, as we've discussed? Now, I would suggest that if you wanted to, one voice of the members could be here. Now, we've had this discussion. We haven't been able to include CIfA and FAME. We would love to. Please come back and talk to us. Have this discussion in public where it should be held, because you are trying to influence the careers, the jobs of current and future archaeologists, even who an archaeologist is and can be. And that has to be something that is subject to a debate, a wider debate than just a relatively small number of people behind closed doors when their wider memberships don't even know it's going on. So if you have thoughts about that, contact CIfA, contact FAME, but please also contact public-facing outlets like the Watching Brief, so that we can participate in that discussion, because non-FAME members and non-CIfA members are archaeologists too. The other thing I would say is, and it's a particular issue with, I talked about earlier, and it's a question for archaeologists. Yeah, developer-funded archaeology is really, really important. Great work is done by developer-funded archaeologists. It is an essential part of the development system in the UK at the moment. And we've talked about it many, many times, and we've talked about fines coming from it many, many times. But there is increasing criticism of the development industry on a number of levels, including from its response to the climate emergency and net zero, to pay and conditions, to the compromises, shall we say, that are forced on archaeologists in order to meet timetables and budgets. And the question I would ask is it sensible for the wider profession of archaeology, which, as CIfA says, has an ultimate responsibility to the public, who we say so often we serve, is it sensible to identify so powerfully with one commercial interest, the development industry?
And in that sense, once again, I think I would just point out the irony, of existing, but not wanting to be accountable. And some of the voices there highlighting how this seems like a self-serving move, or the clarity of the implications of these sorts of stunts, these sorts of announcements, leaves a lot of question marks hanging in the air. I think they're perfectly valid, but it's fascinating. I mean, I suppose at the very least, I'll end on this. At the very least, our email hasn't been blocked, so we can email them. We can email FAME again, going off previous interactions. But also as well, presumably, Andy, you're also inviting members of CIfA and other people, if they have an opinion, to get in touch.
Of course. Look, this is a really important debate. But like I said at the get-go, when we started discussing this, these organisations and others, they act in a public space. They seek to interact with government. They seek to change government policy. That affects more than just their members. And that, to me, means they need to be accountable to the wider public. Doesn't mean they can't make a view. It doesn't mean that FAME can't support the interests of the developer fund, the development industry, or archaeologists that are funded by the development industry. But I think, there are a few things that are more controversial in the public space at the moment than development. And I don't think it is acceptable to effectively not participate in those public debates and at the same time say that you want to have an influence on the outcome.
A distinctive influence. Well, that's been our watching brief. I think the next thing you should see from us will be a seasonal story exploring a case of illegal burial as part of ArchaeoSoup's Halloween offering this year. So I look forward to that. Thank you for your time as ever, Andy. As ever, guys, do comment below. Let us know what you think. If there's any stories that you want us to be examining, please do feel free to reach out on that as well. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.